Alright, so today we're going to have a look at Hellblade 2 with the RTX 4070 Super. That is paired with a 14600K of CPU and 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6400 megatransfers per second CL32 memory. And here we are running at 1080p on the high preset. You only have low, medium and high presets here, and we're running at native resolution, DLAA. And the performance is kind of underwhelming here. We are getting around 80 frames per second. I'm just going to be doing a very short benchmark run here for each setting. I'm getting ready to leave town, so just going through the settings quickly. And here we are, DLSS quality gaining us around 30 frames per second. And this game actually does look quite okay even at 1080p with DLSS quality. I'm not a big fan of upscaling at 1080p, as those of you who've watched my previous videos probably know by now. But in here, it actually doesn't look too bad. Unreal Engine 5 does a very good job here, especially with the geometry. I do believe it uses nanite and lumen, but software lumen, no hardware lumen available. It does have DLSS 3 frame generation, but this is actually a very strange implementation because you can't use frame generation at native resolution. I mean, you can use it with DLAA, but you can't use it with TAA or FSR or XSS, which is kind of strange that it's coupled to DLSS in this game. It's not usually the case. Usually you can use any form of upscaling that you want, but now you can see we're getting a pretty high refresh rate experience here with the DLSS quality and frame generation enabled. And then if you want to run it at a native resolution using DLAA, you can as well, and you're getting around 120 frames per second here. Although at 1080p, I'm not entirely sure that this performance is what we're looking for. Right, it's a 4070 Super. It's supposed to be a decent 1440p GPU, and once we get to 1440p, you'll actually see that it falls quite short in this game. Now, the game is actually a very, very good looking game, and even on the medium settings, it looks quite okay. So we are 1080p medium here with DLAA, and we also gained around 30 to 40 frames per second when compared to the high preset. This game still looks plenty good at medium, and Unreal Engine 5 definitely has a lot to do with that. But from what I've played so far, the game doesn't have a lot of stuttering, which is quite good to see, seeing that it is an Unreal Engine 5 game, and those are notorious for stuttering. And if you want a little bit of a higher frame rate, yeah, we've got the medium preset paired with DLSS quality, and I mean, the gains is not as much as it was when we used the high preset, but still getting around 130 frames per second here. Fairly decent, although our 0.1% lows are kind of low. I do not actually feel the stuttering that you see there in the frame time graph, purely because it is a slower paced game, but it could also be that the frame time spikes are more monitoring software related. Right, so yeah, we have the medium preset DLSS quality with frame generation enabled, getting a very high refresh rate here, getting 170 frames per second. The motion fluidity is amazing at these frame rates. It's slightly higher than my 165 Hz panel, so using VSync I'll get 158 frames per second with the reflex enabled. Still a very good experience, but once again the 0.1% lows are lacking slightly behind here, which is kind of odd, although as I said, I do not really feel those stutters. Now if we want to just run it at native resolution using DLAA, we're getting around 140 frames per second, so perfect for those of you who have a 144 Hz panel. Now I just want to add, I'm benchmarking in this specific spot because the game's combat is very visceral. Like my video would be taken down by YouTube in an instant. It's very, very detailed, very visceral, very gross actually, but very well done. Now here we've got 1440p on the high preset DLAA, and we're not maintaining 60 frames per second, which is disappointing, seeing that as I mentioned earlier, the 4070 Super is supposed to be a very decent 1440p GPU, and I haven't really come across a game where I'm not able to maintain 60 frames per second at 1440p with this GPU. So the game is extremely demanding here. Now, if we kick on DLSS quality, we get a nice, decent bump to the frame rate, around 20 to 30 frames per second, sometimes even 40 frames per second. And using these settings, you'll definitely be able to maintain 60 frames per second at all times. You can see there's a lot happening on the screen here, right? There's a lot of rain. The detail is pretty good, and The game is very gritty. The only complaint that I do have is that the post-processing effects, like chromatic aberration, vignetting, it's maybe a combination of those. It makes the game look kind of weird at the edges, and I haven't found a way to disable that actually. Right, so yeah, we've got DLSS quality with frame generation enabled, getting 120 frames per second. This is pretty much where I'll be playing this game on my 165 hertz panel, and I will be playing this game. The little bit that I've played, that's actually quite interesting. The combat is quite nice. Like it's slow paced, and it's definitely catering more towards my taste. But as I said, the violence in this game is it's mind-blowing. Like it's difficult to convey just how visceral the violence is. You'll have to play it for yourself to actually see. Now, if we just use the native resolution DLAA frame generation on, we're getting around 90 frames per second, although the input latency does become a little bit of an issue here. Although the game is probably not that sensitive to input latency, especially if you play it with the controller, it's definitely noticeable with the keyboard and mouse. Alright, so dropping down to 1440p medium using DLAA, so native resolution once again, we get more or less the same frame rate as what we had with the high preset and DLSS set to quality, although I probably use DLSS quality with the high preset rather than the medium preset, just because the DLSS, it still looks plenty good, right? And the high preset, there is some visual advantages to using the high preset. Now, if we enable DLSS quality, we're getting 110 frames per second, sorry, and also a very good option for those of you with high refresh rate 1440p panels, although the high preset with the DLSS set to quality with frame generation enabled is also a very good option, which as I said, that's probably where I'll be playing the game, and it's a pretty good experience, a very responsive, very fluid experience as well. So kicking on frame generation here, we boost the frame rate up to 145 frames per second. Remember, it does not boost your performance, it just increases the motion fluidity, and I must say that it's actually quite nice to see a game this detailed having such a high frame rate. I know we use trickery to get this high frame rate, but it does look nice and it feels nice. So if you are aiming for a higher than 120 frames per second, then these are settings that you can definitely consider as well. If you're curious of what the performance would be like at native resolution with frame generation at 1440p on the medium preset, here you go, getting around 110 frames per second. Still a very good experience, but I personally would use DLSS quality rather. Like, sure, you get a very high frame rate here. The input latency is not as noticeable, but DLSS quality does increase or improve the input latency, lowers the input latency, so and at very little visual cost. So that's probably what I'd be using. Alright, so now if we move on to 4K on the high preset, we're using DLAA, we're getting around 30 frames per second. The game looks absolutely stunning on a 4K monitor using these settings, and my GPU is crying a little bit. It's sitting at 77 degrees Celsius there, but all in all, the game is definitely a very, very good looking game. It's a very gritty, disturbing game. The sound design is out of this world. It's phenomenal. When it comes to gameplay, it might or might not be for you, but from the little that I've played, I actually did enjoy it. Now, if we kick on DLSS quality here, we can almost maintain 60 frames per second. The game still looks phenomenal. You can just see everything react to the wind here. The rain, the water actually reacts to the wind as well. The only other thing that just does not look good is the ocean waves. I'll show you that at the end of the video when we go through the settings. The waves look terrible, but other than that, like, the game is it's a looker, right? It looks like a playable tech demo basically. Now, if we kick on DLSS frame generation here alongside DLSS quality upscaling, then we get around 80 frames per second here, give or take, but the input latency is noticeable on keyboard and mouse. If you play on a controller, it might not be as noticeable. I would probably just advise you to drop this down to DLSS balanced, because we do get a slight boost in the frame rate, as we can see here. So this is without frame generation, right? So with DLSS balanced, we are getting just above 60 frames per second, and through my run here, it does maintain 60 frames per second. 99.9% of the time it dropped there once, but I'm not entirely sure how demanding the rest of the game is, but just from what I've seen online, I think this is a fair representation of what the game would run like. Maybe it'll run slightly better in certain areas. I did not have a lot of time to actually go further in the game, as I'm getting ready to depart for another city. Anyway, so if we kick on frame generation here using DLSS balanced, sure, the frame rate is not that much higher than what we had with DLSS quality and frame generation, but it does feel quite a bit more responsive. So if you are playing at 4K, I'd definitely recommend these settings if you're happy with 90 frames per second. Now dropping this down to medium on using DLAA, so no upscaling, we are getting around 50 frames per second, so falling just short of that 60 frames per second by around 20%. I target 60 frames per second. I know this game runs at 30 frames per second on the Xbox, so if that's the experience you cater or desire, then you can use these settings and just lock it to 30 frames per second, or even 40 frames per second, and it'll maintain 40 frames per second pretty much. Right, so just kicking on DLSS quality here, get a very decent bump in the frame rate here, almost double at times, right? We saw 80 frames per second there, and the frame time graph is not is quite okay. It's quite smooth. There's not a lot of stuttering there. Like, I do think those little blimps are software monitoring issues, right? But we've got an average of 76 frames per second, which is very good, and our 0.1% lows aren't too terrible either. Now, if we use DLSS quality with frame generation, we get 100 frames per second here, and this is actually pretty good. The responsiveness, the input latency, everything feels very good, even on keyboard or mouse. If you use a controller, it'll be even better. But this is something that I personally would use if I had to daily drive a 4K monitor. I mean, I do have a 4K monitor. It's just a 60 Hz monitor, but I only use that for benchmarking, so it's not relevant to me. If we then forego DLSS upscaling and we just kick on frame generation using DLAA, we're getting around 80 frames per second. But once again, the input latency is definitely noticeable. Whether it's going to bother you or not will depend on the person. Some people would be perfectly fine, because, as I said, it is a slower paced game. Even during combat, it's quite slow, right? Timing, that you do have parry and block, etc., so timing might be important to you there, and that's maybe when you should be using upscaling rather. Right, so if we just drop this down to DLSS balanced on 4K on the medium preset, we're still getting around 80 frames per second, so pretty much what we had previously with frame generation without DLSS. And this is actually a better experience because it's a lot more responsive. You don't have that additional input delay from DLSS frame generation. And then our last setting we'll be testing here is just DLSS balanced with frame generation enabled, and we're getting a high refresh rate experience here with 4K output. It's not 4K internal resolution, so we can't say it's 4K gaming, but getting 114, 115 frames per second here. If you do have a 120 Hz monitor, this will get close to maxing that out, which is great to see. Alright, so just going to run to the end of my benchmark run here, and then I just want to go through a few of the options here. I know that this video is maybe a little bit shorter than usual, or not as detailed as usual. As I said, I'm running a little bit out of time, but here you can see DLSS frame generation is only usable when you use DLSS as an upscaler, which is kind of weird. I haven't seen that before. Then we do have VRS, and then we also have the presets. We only have 3 presets, low, medium, and high. And there's a bunch of options there, but it's not detailed. There's not a lot of settings that you can actually change. Right, and then one thing you can actually preview. So if you press space, it'll show you the preview. It'll show you the CPU time, the GPU time, the frames per second. And it shows you in real time what the performance would be like if you use different settings. Now, I don't think that frame generation applies to this one, but you can see that with TSR, we're getting 50 frames per second. And I mean, if we use any of the other upscaling techs, like we basically double that, but it is using the balanced preset because that's what the option that I selected in the menu was. So this is actually quite nice to see. It'll show you the video memory usage and the frame times for both the CPU and the GPU, which is very, very nice to see. All right, so I'm just going to run around a little bit just so you can see what the game looks like. This is on the medium preset. I'll show you the waves quickly. At first glance, the waves look quite good, but then it looks like there's textures missing and water missing, reflections missing. It just looks like there's a blank space. Now, I know that the water gets pulled back when a new wave forms, but that does not seem to be what's causing that. So let's try and see if it actually improves on the high preset. And it doesn't. Like, it just looks like something's missing. I don't know how to explain it, but the water looks terrible. Like the rain and stuff looks great, but the ocean just does not look that good. All right, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.